Do you have a deck that can't seem to win? It can be an old deck that is no longer powerful enough, or a precon that just doesn't compete with your playgroup. Perhaps you made a brew of your own, and it just doesn't work well. So what now? You could throw the deck in the trash and build something new, but before you do that, listen to these tips and see if they help. First, if you want to pick up any singles to upgrade your deck, you can get 5% off if you use code TTM at checkout from today's sponsor, Cool Stuff Inc. Link in the description below. Also, consider subscribing if you like my content. So why even upgrade your commander deck? In a lot of videos I make about helping people improve their decks, I do occasionally get comments from people saying that improving your deck for the purpose of winning goes against the spirit of EDH. So I wanted to address that first. I disagree with this idea entirely. EDH is about having fun playing Magic, and for many people, some of that fun comes from winning, or at least having a chance at winning. There is a massive difference between only caring about winning and wanting a chance at winning the game. In casual Commander, winning is absolutely not everything, but it does feel bad when your deck simply cannot compete, and you're just doing nothing all game, and then you lose. There is nothing wrong with playing a crazy, wacky gimmick deck that only wins 1 out of every 1,000 games. But there's also nothing wrong with wanting a win rate higher than 10%. So if your deck never wins any games and you're happy with it, that's fine. I'm not hating on that at all. I just think wanting to have a fighting chance at winning a Commander game does not go against the spirit of EDH. With that out of the way, let's move on to the first step in upgrading your deck, and that's just getting the basics down. A lot of people assume that to upgrade your deck, you need to spend a ton of money on big, powerful finishers and expensive tutors and all these other unnecessary bits. But I think it's more important to have the basic elements of your deck first. A lot of players who are spending money on big, flashy mythics forget that they might need to upgrade their mana base first. Your mana is very important, especially if you're playing 3 or more colors. You should be upgrading your mana base. I feel like a lot of people just don't ever get around to it. And you don't need to spend a fortune on fetches, shocks, and duels. There are tons of great dual lands you could be running for cheap. The Tango lands are really excellent in any 2-color deck that has a reasonable amount of basics. Right now, many of the Czech lands are super cheap from the most recent printing. Honestly, depending on when you watch this video, whatever land cycle is in Standard currently, especially if it's a reprinted land cycle, is probably going to be really cheap, and that's the best time to just pick those up. If you're in a monocolor deck, that doesn't mean you should neglect your mana base. There are tons of powerful utility lands in every single color where you can cut a few basics to add those utility lands, and it will likely improve your deck. Also, be sure to run enough lands, like 36 or 37 lands, including MDFCs. I see a lot of players running around 30 or less, which is almost always too few lands. Another crucial part of any deck is going to be the ramp package. Again, you don't need mana crypts or jeweled lotuses to make your deck good. Just removing the 4 and 3 mana ramp spells and replacing them with 2 mana ramp will usually speed up your deck. But you don't need to just jam every 2 mana ramp spell that you can. Look at where your ramp falls on the curve. If you have a 5 mana commander you want to slam down ASAP, then 3 mana ramp is just as good as 2, since it will let you cast your commander on turn 4. Then you can play some of the utility 3 mana ramp spells, like the new Patchwork Banner in an Admiral Brass Unsinkable deck. You can play your looting effects on turn 1 or 2, and then on 3, play the Patchwork for ramp, follow up with your commander, and swing with a 5/5. Let's talk a little bit more about mana curve in general. Your curve is an important part of any deck. In Commander though, your curve does not need to be as low or evenly balanced as it would in other formats. Instead, think of what your deck wants to do on each turn. I'll use my Mina and Den deck as an example. This deck has very few 4 and 5 mana spells, but a lot more 3 and 6 cost cards. The reason is, my commander is a 4 mana value piece, which usually does not warrant any removal. So when I cast my commander, that's almost always what I want to do when I have 4 mana, and then I throw down my extra land for turn. That means next turn, if I have at least 1 other land, I'll have 6 mana. Meaning casting 2 3 mana value cards or 1 6 mana bomb is usually more mana efficient than just playing another 4 or 5 drop. It doesn't mean I'm excluding 4 and 5 mana cards that I think are valuable, it just means I'm focusing more on the 3 and 6 mana options that fit those roles. If your deck is looking to cast your 3 mana commander every game on 3, then filling your deck with other 3 mana cards might not be as good as playing some more efficient on curve 4 drops. Card draw is another basic element of deck building and the second most neglected in my opinion. It's really easy to slam all of your fun synergy cards and not have enough card draw to back it all up. It's almost impossible to have too much card draw, so just jam as much as you can in your deck. For almost every theme, there are so many ways you can leverage card advantage. Discard decks get Geth's Grimoire, creature decks play Bident of Thassa, and lands decks can play Tireless Tracker, and so on and so forth. Whatever type of deck you're playing, there are probably some great card draw options that fit the theme. On to the most neglected thing in every commander deck: removal. In every deck, you should have some way to deal with every permanent type. For colorless and mono black, that is a little tricky. You do have Scour and Meteor Golem and Invasion of Ravnica, but I understand that your options are limited for enchantment removal outside of those. I see a lot of decks which have 0 ways to deal with enchantments or artifacts. I've met multiple players who just run 2 board wipes, and that's all for removal. Or if you're in blue, you should be running some counter magic. Counter spells are such amazing catch-alls. It's removal for most anything, even instants and sorceries. I'm also lumping graveyard interaction in here. There are so many powerful cards that can use the graveyard, you will almost always run into a deck where your graveyard hate is relevant. I don't want to make this whole video about removal, but seriously, take a look at your deck and check. Can you actually destroy an artifact? What if that artifact was indestructible? How about an enchantment? Just make sure you can hit everything, because with 3 random opponents, you're gonna run into a lot of different things. Those were the basic elements of deck building, and once you got that out of the way, what next? I would recommend focusing your deck. There are a lot of times where I see players use cards that are very situational or only work with a few other cards in the deck, causing them to be dead most of the time. And these cards usually aren't focused on the main theme of the deck. This also includes win more cards. I have a whole separate video just about that. You can watch it here, but in a nutshell, don't overload on cards that only work when you're in the lead, because some games, when you fall behind, it will be almost impossible to get back. Focusing the deck also ties into just having too much going on. Oftentimes, you will try to do many things with your deck, something personally I'm really guilty of. Part of this can be pet cards, you know, the things you add just because you like them, not because it's good in the deck. Another thing I'm guilty of: if you ever see any of my deck lists, which are in the description of this video and my other videos going forward, and if you see something that doesn't really fit with the rest of the deck, it's probably just a card I like, and for the most part, my decks would improve if I cut those. But pet cards are also fun, so I don't want to tell you to just cut anything you don't want to. Just realize that too many pet cards can slog your deck down, so be careful not to go overboard. Sometimes your pet cards or a set of other cards you like in the 99 can become a sub-theme. Sub-themes are not inherently a bad thing, especially if you're playing a theme that does not have a lot of support. But there are times where people try to fit too many extra bits into a deck, and trimming down a life gain package or equipment package to focus more on the main theme will often help your deck function better in the long run. Now, the opposite can be true depending on what you're playing. Some sub-themes can work really well. If you're playing a theme that doesn't have a lot of support, like a Sunforger deck for example, you might want an equipment package in the deck, because you probably don't want Sunforger as the only equipment in your deck if you're running tutors for equipment. Or if you lean more into equipment, you might want a Spellslinger sub-theme, because when you don't have the Sunforger in play, you want to be able to get value out of the instants and sorceries within your deck. Think about the small packages in your deck and whether or not they could be replaced with more support for the main theme overall. Here's the big one. I can suggest a lot of general things, and I hope those helped, but this is the best tip I can give you. Figure out why you lost. This might be harder than it sounds, but analyzing your loss is the #1 way to improve your deck. Sometimes this can be very obvious. If you lost to a Muldrotha deck because they kept recurring threats over and over again, you probably just need some way to exile graveyards. Or if you struggle with some Pillow Fort artifact or enchantment and you can't attack through it, you might want to run more ways to remove them. Did you lose to a combo because you didn't recognize the combo pieces in time? Easy fix, you don't even need to change your deck. You just now know that those are combo pieces and you can react differently next game. But what if it's less obvious? Sometimes you lose and wonder what exactly happened, especially if it was a long game. The reason you lost might not be immediately recognizable. Now, some amount of losses can be attributed to variance. If you're running 38 lands and you only saw 3 the whole game, it happens. You're just unlucky, that's fine. But what I would recommend you do is take note of what your deck felt like it was missing each game. And I really do mean what your deck is missing, not focusing on what your opponents played. You probably can't change that. Instead, think of what changes you can make to your deck. Couldn't remove things, too much X, not enough Y, unable to beat this one card. And this will also help improve your gameplay as well. If you noticed they ran away with this card draw engine, and I spent my removal early on this other thing, then next time maybe you should just hold your removal a little bit longer. And as you write these down, you might see a pattern. If the most common thing you're writing down is you couldn't get past blockers, then maybe that's the thing you need to change. Adding more ways to slip past defenses or remove blockers. Think of counterplay to the cards you lost to. There's almost always an answer, and this type of deck tuning needs to be done over time. One game won't help very much. This is also how you balance out your deck. I didn't want to give too many specific numbers in this video. A lot of people try and give deck building guides with you need 6 of these and 3 of these and 5 of those. And although you can give some general numbers for card draw, ramp, removal, and those are fine, the actual specific numbers about how many sack outlets you need, how many finishers, how many token generators, is something that I can't tell you. There is no secret here. It all comes down to your list, your meta. Your commander does play a big part in it, so I would recommend if your commander makes tokens, then maybe you want more anthems in the 99. If your commander is an anthem, you probably want more token generators in the 99, since your commander is the most consistent part of your deck. Once you start really focusing on why you lost games, it'll be easy to discern what your deck needs. The difficult part is figuring out what to cut from the list afterwards. A bit more on that later. I wanted to also dedicate a little section of this video to budget. I feel like a lot of players are discouraged from upgrading their decks because of price. Oh, my deck needs more card draw, but I don't want to buy the One Ring. And that's totally valid. And we'll ignore proxies for the moment here. I think people put too much weight on the best option for their deck. Yes, Craterhoof is one of the best finishers for a go-wide deck. The One Ring is probably one of the best card draw options of all time. But if your deck needs more card draw or more finishers, then almost any good card draw or good finishers will do. An overwhelming Stampede is not as good as Craterhoof, but it's still decent. Craterhoof is for sure better if you have a lot of 1/1s, but if you regularly have many creatures of varying power, then a Stampede can easily still knock multiple players out of the game. And yes, the One Ring is an excellent overpowered power crept card. But in a 3-color deck, a Painful Truths will get you 3 cards for 3 life. And that's 3 cards immediately, not over 2 turns like the One Ring. I'm not trying to say that these budget options are better than the expensive counterparts. Painful Truths is worse than the One Ring. I'm just saying if your deck needs card draw or needs a finisher, you don't need to turn to the most powerful option. Simply adding more of that thing will still improve the deck. I want to talk about 2 examples of decks I'm currently playing that could use upgrades and try to show these tips in action. I'll put a link in the description to my Mox field where you can see all the decks I currently play and links to these 2 decks. First, my Heliod list. I've been working on it for a while. The idea of the deck is I wanted to build draw-go control in the worst color option for it. I decided not to go with colorless because that's a little too difficult, and originally it was mono red, but red got too many good cards over time and red control just became good, so I swapped to mono white. The deck aims to use Heliod for virtual card advantage, where I can just spend as much mana as I have to make dudes if I don't need to spend mana on removal. Then the deck does some enchantment synergy stuff, some control-y stacksy things. The problem I run into is just cards. Control requires card advantage, and unsurprisingly, mono white is not the best option at that. So I plan to add more. Also, this deck takes a lot of chip damage because it's very slow to actually convert into a win. So after many attempts with this deck, I feel like it has real power in the late game with Divine Visitation and Smokestacks, but a lot of my losses were I took too much damage and couldn't gain it back, or I ran out of gas and just didn't have the cards to compete. In fact, I died to my own mana crypt so many times that I just cut it from the list. If you watched my last gameplay stream, I took 15 damage from my crypt, and it probably cost me the game. So the deck needs life gain to sustain itself from chip damage, and the deck needs more card draw to just facilitate the control game plan a little further. So I plan to add more of both of those. If you have any suggestions for card draw in this deck or life gain, let me know. I'll check them out. My Thrasios Tormod deck is a whole separate story. I had this idea to play channel cards and using those as my control pieces. And then I would loop these channel cards back to my hand to reuse them for extra value. So Thrasios would ramp me into the mana I needed to do that, and Tormod would get me extra value when I loop cards from the graveyard back to hand, eventually letting me attack with a zombie army. The deck had a lot of fun value engines like Cat Oven Combo to make extra zombies, or just Phyrexian Reclamation to get back Colossal Sky Turtles and bounce different things or return other stuff to hand. The problem with the deck is consistency. The deck can easily draw the wrong half, where I hit all my card draw and removal and counter spells, but I don't get the actual recursion enchantments that I need. And there are a lot of key enchantments in this deck that are needed for it to run. And the deck usually needs some of the channel creatures as well to work with the engine. When it does all come together, this deck is really powerful. But when it doesn't come together, it just spins its wheels. So at this point, I could either add more tutors, since there are not that many enchantments which do the effect that I want, or I could change the deck. Sometimes when I cook up an idea for a deck that has a lot of moving parts, I'll just scrap it after it's done its thing a few times. Here's my last deck building tip. I firmly believe scrapping a deck is a great way to improve a deck, which might sound a little counterintuitive. I know I said not to throw away your deck at the start, but there are exceptions. I've wanted to play some green-blue control deck for a while now. Originally it was Krufix, and then it was Zimone Quandrix Prodigy, and then I added a color. And sometimes expanding on your ideas for a deck might mean changing the whole deck. You might find a sub-theme in your deck that was more powerful or fun than you thought, and wanted to change that to the main theme of your list. I really liked the value and recursion of Colossal Sky Turtle, and I wanted to repeatedly do that over and over again, which is why I added more regrowth effects, and then I added black to get the value from Tormod and the other enchantments in these colors. But ultimately, I think this deck is ahead of its time. There isn't enough of these types of effects for me to use it as a real win condition. But I'm going to be taking a lot of the blue-green control elements I learned here from testing out this deck and try out some of these cards in other decks that I'm working on. Okay, so putting it all together, once you have the basics of lands, ramp, card draw, removal, and your curve, the best way to improve a deck is find out why you're losing and reflect on what you can change about your deck. It's much easier to improve when you focus on your shortcomings rather than getting salty over something your opponents did. Hopefully, after taking notes from a few losses, you'll realize what your deck is missing. I really hope that you are able to use some of these tips to improve your deck. But do you feel like you need more examples or more help? Well, then you're in luck. If you're watching this video when it comes out, then this coming Sunday, I will be doing a live stream where I will be reviewing decks from some of my patrons. You can join live, ask questions, and see me use these tips actively on different people's decks. If you're not watching this when the video gets published, no worries, the VOD from the live stream will be up for free on my channel. You can watch it there. If you want to submit a deck list for a future deck review, check out the Patreon. I'll be trying to do these streams every single month. The streams overall are just new content that I want to try out, so please let me know what you think about them once you see it. Thanks for watching, and special thanks to my Tier 3 patrons whose names you see here.